This is a brief discussion of what is sustainable development and what is sustainable transitions. First, I want to share with you some phrases, some definitions that talk about the process of moving towards sustainability, which we call sustainable development, which of course is a big discussion among several scholars and social groups and governments and politicians. One that I like a lot is the following. A thing is right when it intends to preserve the integrity, stability and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. This was outlined by Aldo Leopold, who has been involved in several environmental movements in the US. It talks about tendencies, preservation, and it talks about beauty, which many definitions about sustainability and sustainable development don't do. And it talks about the biotic community, which is a reference to the ecological limits of the world. He outlined this definition at a time when we first started to notice that we have very limited resources. And two images, Blue Marble and Earthrise, taken by astronauts, help to fix this idea that we are very small in the universe, and we have to take that into account. The most cited definition of sustainability and sustainable development is the one or there are several outlined in the Brundtland report. I like this one. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In this definition, although not explicitly, there's a reference to our children and our grandchildren. And I think that's very important, because when we talk about future generations, it sounds like long away. You can detach yourself from the future generations, but you can't do that from your children. In my case, I have two girls here in Denmark, and we educate them under the idea that, or the assumption that they will live here the rest of their lives. So we tend, if I only focus on sustainability, thinking on them and their future life in Denmark, then I have a very limited view of how to do that. But when I think in my nephews, I have nephews in several parts of the world, in Calgary in Canada, in Washington in the US, and in Bogota in Colombia, then the picture is different. Then I have to think worldwide. And my family happens to be multinational, but there are other families that are not multinational, but that doesn't mean that it is not necessary to think worldwide. When I think in children and grandchildren, I cannot be detached from what is going to happen. And many of the discussions really makes me aware that many of the things we do today are going to be paid by my children and my grandchildren. So that really makes it a pressing issue to start addressing sustainability and sustainable development now, not in a few years. But these definitions that come from people in the US and people in the North, the Brundtland report was, of course, a commission from the United Nations, but it is known as the Brundtland report after the Prime Minister of the time in Norway. So there's always this kind of, in the United States commissions, there's always this kind of idea that is Europe, especially Northern Europe, that has leadership and has responsibility for the commissions. So there's a problem there of who is setting the agenda. And the Brundtland report has produced this triangle, this triple bottom idea that sustainability has to address components of environmental limits, social limits, and economic growth. And many people tend to detach those three dimensions, like if they could be independent from each other. But that's wrong, of course. That's not the intention of the report. The report said they have to address integrally. That means that a sustainable solution or a project that tends towards sustainability has to address the three dimensions. But as I said, some people and some strategies and some companies just don't do that. There are many other voices that critique and make points about how the discussion on sustainability and sustainable development is being carried out, and especially who is saying something about it. For example, Bobby Banerjee, an Indian who immigrated to Australia, said, criticizing the Brundtland report, "What we need is not a common future, but the future as commons," which makes this point that we need not to move to a future that's defined by a few people in Europe. We need to develop the ability of understand what is it that we want in the future as a collective, as a world community, in order to make that happen. So that places emphasis in saying sustainable development is not about moving to a specific objective, but especially of including everybody in the whole process. And there's another very inspiring professor who I like. It's called Julian Eigenmann. He works at Tufts University in the United States, although he's originally from the United Kingdom. And he has been addressing the issue of justice, which is very absent in all the discussion of sustainable development. So he and his colleagues have produced the following definition. Sustainability is clearly a contested concept, but our interpretation of it places great emphasis upon precaution, on the need to ensure a better quality of life for all now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. So I like this definition because it places emphasis on doing things now. We live now, today, in a very unsustainable world, especially in terms of social justice. We have everything in places like Denmark. We don't suffer hunger or violence of many of the things, but to have those things we have in Denmark, iPhones, I'm recording this in an iPhone, and things like that, there are many people who suffer. So our sustainability is at the cost of the unsustainability of a lot of people in the world, and we have to take an action on that. But that's one level, having definitions that may make us think, what is it sustainability all about? We have to give up the idea that we'll have one definition that is produced by a clever mind. If we ever have a definition, that should be a definition that we have constructed together, all the people in the world. And that's, of course, a major desire, but we have to retain that desire. There is also clear that we should be moving away from many of the systems and the type of economic activity we have today. But many people don't do that. So let me just tell you a couple of horror histories I have lived through my academic life. Last year, in a conference called Engineering Education for Sustainable Development in Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, the keynote speaker was Lord Brown, who's president of the steering committee of British Petroleum. He spoke a whole hour about fracking as the future of oil exploitation. He didn't say anything about sustainability. At the end of his lecture, I asked him, but shouldn't we be get rid of oil altogether? And his response was, we can't do it. So there are clearly some activities, some companies, some initiatives, and some people we have to move away from if we want to make sustainable development happen. If we want to make a real transition towards sustainability. It is important to have some definitions we can use in discussions as guidelines when we're doing design, as an idea of the bearing we should be moving towards. It is important to have a notion of what is being discussed and what kind of definitions of sustainability are out there in practice. What do people claim is sustainability and a way of moving towards sustainability? And it is important also to have clear what we should be moving away from and who is not allowing that. There's another view of sustainable development which it is there in the chapter you have read, and which I think we should be privileging. And it's the one forward by the United States environmental sociologist Blake Ratner. He talks about dialogue of values when it comes to sustainability. because he recognizes that many people talk about sustainability as this ethical imperative. But where does this come from? This ethical imperative should be built by everybody in the world, by the different knowledges that are out there. And that can only be done through dialogue. On the other hand, there's a lot of activity on sustainability. Some is well-intentioned but goes in the wrong direction. Some is bad-intentioned and goes in the wrong direction. And some, it's well-intended but doesn't have the technical instruments to do it. So when it comes to sustainability in practice out there, there's a lot of CO2 emission counting and discussion because that's measurable. But when it comes to inequalities, the picture is more difficult. So there's this gap between those who are moving towards the building of a common ethical imperative and those who are working on the actual sustainable design, sustainable projects, sustainable whatever activities out there. So we need to keep adjusting, developing our tools, and at the same time develop this common ethical imperative we have to share in order to become a real, true, sustainable society. But again, that can only be done by taking into account things that are happening here and in other places of the world. And that is a world dialogue that has to be taken up. And it has been taken up by several organizations, badly or wrongly, but some of them have should be paid attention to. So dialogue is not easy, and it will not be completed within the next generation or two, but it has to be something that we put into action, that we contribute to in order to make sustainability something that is actually happening and evolving and improving the world. This also follows on Robert Norgaard's analysis of the problem. He is a professor at a university in California, and he states that urbanization, class division, multinational business, global trade, and bureaucratic management systems help concentrate economic and political power at a world level. Therefore, correcting unsustainability of development is not simply a matter of choosing different technologies for intervening in the environment. The mechanisms of perceiving, choosing, and using technologies are embedded in social structures which are themselves products of modern technologies. So what Robert Norgaard do here is, one, to recognize that it's not only about the environment, and two, to acknowledge that there is a number of what we're going to call in sustainable transition theory incumbents which are hindering change, and we have to do something with them. So from his point of view, there's an overemphasis on technical fixes which are conceived primarily to solve environmental issues, and this is not enough, obviously. So to move from this technical narrow level towards the common ethical imperative suggested by Ratner, we need to recognize that our societies are composed of complex socio-technical systems, and that we need to intervene in those systems to get rid of some of them, to modify others, and especially to create new ones, so our societies can become truly sustainable. This task is what we call sustainable transitions. So what is sustainable transitions? It is a subfield of study that concentrates on conceiving change as socio-technical by nature. In other words, neither pure political will and transformation of human organizations on one side, nor technological developments alone will deliver the needed change to make our societies sustainable. So within this sustainable transitions community of researchers, which is, by the way, it's mainly European at the moment. It's very provincial in that sense. There's a great strength in addressing the change at the systems level. So it's not only about designing small stuff, small artifacts, small gadgets. It's about intervening at the systemic level, at the level of relationships, where changes can have a greater impact. But this means that creating new things, creating new relationships means messing up with the existing and actually interrupting existing relationships. So one particular recognition of this field is that innovation requires active destruction, or that creation by destruction. This has a long tradition in innovation studies for more than 100 years, so it's not something new. But it tends to be overlooked in policies at a European level and in the ways in our societies we allocate resources for innovation. There is a tendency to allocate money for doing new stuff, like it could be done isolated from the rest of society, and that those new things has to be technological in nature. Transitions theory, sustainable transitions theory, has a strong criticism towards that view, because it begins by recognizing that there is a variety of highly institutionalized processes that tend to perpetuate existing systems. So the fact that Lord Brown was in this sustainability conference talking about fracking, which is the main business of British Petroleum now, was one way of showing that British Petroleum is not going to change. He was using a social opportunity to promote his business, his company's business as usual, and not to engage truly in sustainable debate. That's a way of showing how this highly institutionalized process that perpetuate existing systems are resistant to change, and they have a lot of resources. So sustainable transitions recognized that there are systems, there are infrastructures, there are institutions. They call them incumbents. You can regard them as the established order, and they are by nature resistant to change. So the questions to be addressed here are, one, for example, is how and why do existing systems or regimes endure and reproduce, and why do they resist to change? What more interesting for you as sustainable designers is how do new innovations and practices emerge? How do they gain momentum in niches, adapt, grow, and become mainstream? How is the struggle between green innovations and incumbent systems? Under which conditions can green innovations, can sustainable designs exert greater influence? What are the responses of incumbent actors? What are the recurring patterns and mechanisms we have to deal with? Or these are the type of questions sustainable transitions address. The knowledge that has been developed to address these questions is tentative and varied. There are several competing theories with their strengths and limitations, and in this course we're going to be touching on some of them. Theories like the multi-level perspective, arenas of development, technological innovation systems, and practice theory. But we're going to place emphasis on what we can take from those theories in order to understand what are the resources you have as sustainable designers to intervene in systems, to produce new systems that are sustainable, and to intervene in existing systems to make them sustainable.